It is a wonderful honor and a pleasure to welcome to LTSP Dr. Richard Osmer. Dr. Osmer is the Thomas W. Synnott Professor of Christian Education and the chair of the department at Princeton Theological Seminary, which is widely recognized as the premier department of Christian education in the country, I think, by everybody. He's a major leader in Christian education in this country and beyond. An ordained Presbyterian minister, Dr. Osmer holds an MDiv from Yale University and a PhD from Emory University. He chairs the committee to write new catechisms for the Presbyterian Church USA. And he's a colleague I met years ago, right? Probably we were working out about 22 years ago on a consultative group that met semi-annually at Union Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. It was a great time. We had a good group there who met for 4 years, and it was a joy to meet Rick there and to have known him since. I admire so much Dr. Osmer's attention to theological and biblical foundations of Christian education, his highlighting of the importance of teaching theology, his insights into practical theology, his expertise at all age levels, his breadth of understanding of ecumenical issues, and his recurrent focus on the church as a locus for teaching. His books have been required reading in my courses for many years, as many of you know. Many of you cut your educational teeth on his book, A Teachable Spirit, Recovering the Teaching Office of the Church. And I know that you have been reading his books ever since. Some of you right now are reading The Teaching Ministry of Congregations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Osmer to our podium.
Thank you, Margaret. This is a busy time of year for academics, and as you can imagine, one of the motivating reasons for me to be with you today and to take time out of grading papers and wrapping up my semester is really to pay homage to this woman right here who just introduced me. As Margaret mentioned, we go back at least 22 years, I think, when both of us were younger and were working together on this Lily project in Richmond, Virginia. Margaret herself still has a reputation at Princeton as one of Jim Loder's few graduate students who was able to get something practical out of Loder's writings when she turned it into. So, I mean, she's maintained that all these years. And I feel very fortunate to be here to honor her and to have had the privilege of working with two of the graduates of this institution who've been my own PhD students, Jana Strukova and Jessica Cray Duckworth, who is right back there. And will be leading the workshop later today and is in the last stages of finishing what I think is going to be a very important dissertation. So, Margaret, good to be with you. A couple weeks ago, when Easter was being celebrated, I heard a story of three little boys who were trying to explain to each other what Easter was all about. And the first boy said, well, Easter, that's when everybody dyes the eggs and you hide them and then you scurry around and try to find them, and when you find them, you get rewarded with chocolate. And the second boy said, well, no, that's not what Easter's about. Easter's when everybody gets dressed up and they put on big hats and they walk down the street. And the third boy said, that's not what Easter. You guys have got it all wrong. Easter's, it's about Jesus, and he's dead, and he's buried in his grave, and on the third day he comes back out and he sees his shadow and goes back in. My grandmother, Dorothy Lupke, was a German Lutheran who was raised in St. Louis, Missouri. And I can remember her telling me stories of what it was like to grow up in what was basically a Lutheran German enclave, somewhere, I think, in East St. Louis. Her father was a baker and had his own little bakery shop. And she said that all her friends when she grew up were Lutherans, and they all walked to school together, and they all went to the same congregation together. And every day after school, sort of as a little pack, they would come back home. They would walk back to their neighborhood, and they would stop in her father's shop. And she said, you know, you just walk in the door and you'd kind of get the aroma of the fresh baked goods. And one of my her father's favorite things was to say, come on, Dot. And she would come and sit in his lap, and he'd ask her a question of Luther's small catechism that they were studying for the week. And if she got it right, he'd give her a kiss on the cheek and a hug and give her some special sweet. And if she didn't get it right, then he would say, well, that's okay, sweetheart. You can do better next time. But they wouldn't get the sweet. Now, our context has changed. My grandmother may have grown up learning Luther's small catechism, sitting in her father's lap. But we live in a context when 3 little boys don't know the difference between Easter and Groundhog's Day. Our context is much more secular. We live in an era where we have dual career couples, which means that fewer and fewer people are actually carrying out any Christian education in the home. We live in an era where denominational identity isn't nearly as important as it used to be. In fact, religious switching to a large extent has become the norm for most folks. You may grow up in a Lutheran congregation, but there's no guarantee that you're going to stay in a Lutheran congregation the rest of your life. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life has just come out with a new batch of research. I think it just came out within the last 4 or 5 weeks, and you can get it online. It's called the U.S. Religious Landscape Survey. And in that survey, they say, this is, as of 6 weeks ago, 28% of American adults have left the faith in which they were raised in order to join another religion or denomination or no religion at all. 48% of all Protestants now belong to another denomination other than one they were raised in or religion, or have joined the ranks of the unaffiliated, which now stands at 16.1% of the American population. Today I want to reflect on this changed context that we live in light of one line of theological discussion, which for purposes of simplicity, I'm simply going to call the missional church discussion. This discussion began with a series of meetings by missionary societies and theologians right at the end of the 19th century, and then had periodic meetings over the course of the 20th century. They were sponsored at one point after the 40s by the World Council of Churches, and they included quite a few of the most famous theologians of the 20th century. This discussion has morphed in recent years and has become quite ecumenical and diverse. It includes Baptists and Lutherans and Presbyterians and people who are part of non-denominational congregations. Some of the Lutherans who are involved in it are people like Doug Hall, Canadian, Pat Kiefert, who's written a number of books that are contribute to this, and then Craig Van Gelder as well. I'm going to try to begin by just saying a word or two about what do we mean by a missional church. And what I'm going to say is real simple, given kind of the diversity of things that are said about this today, but I just want to feature 2 particular things that will frame the rest of my discussion. First, missional churches are congregations that are learning to view their context as a mission field and themselves as missionaries. Now, one of the people who helped me think about what's at stake in this is an author named Leslie Newbigin. He's written quite a few things, The Gospel in a Pluralistic Society, The Open Secret. I've written down a couple of his books. I've given you a little brief bibliography at the end of the handout of some of the books that I'm going to be referring to today. Newbigin was a missionary. He grew up in England and then was a missionary in India for about 40 years. And in one of his books, he talks about how difficult it is to sort of go from one context where people have a whole language that's interwoven with Christianity to another context and try to explain the gospel in a language that seems to lack key terms that you just sort of rely on to explain what the gospel means. And he wrote in one of his books, Indian wisdom has generally, and he's speaking here of the difficulty of describing the Christian concept of hope. He said, Indian wisdom has generally advised man that it's better to be content with what he has and not to follow the vain delusions of hope, which in the end are bound to disappoint him. If there is a hope, according to this tradition, it's rather to be found in escape from this world, from the grip of our karma and the endless cycle of rebirth. And he went on to talk about instances of sort of going into different villages, traveling around and trying to introduce folks in another language to the meaning of the gospel and what a struggle that was. But then later, just a few pages in the same book, he begins to talk about what a shock it was when he returned to England after 40 years. He was struck by the extent to which England had now become a post-Christian society. He came to believe that, in fact, England was a more difficult mission field than India. It wasn't that people were encountering the gospel for the first time and hearing it with a kind of freshness and new ears, but rather in England, most people had kind of heard about Christianity. They'd grown up in Christianity. They knew about it. And in many ways, they'd already made up their minds about its relevance or its irrelevance to their lives. So I think the first challenge that any of us face, if we're leaders of congregations and we're trying to think about our congregations as missional churches, is to own up to the task of seeing ourselves in a North American context as living in a mission field, and that we ourselves are missionaries in that field in a very difficult context. The second thing I want to point to frame my discussion is that missional congregations or churches are churches which are discovering their own mission within the mission of God. Now, a number of years ago, my wife and I and 3 other couples from our seminary banded together our resources, and we rented a sailboat at St. Martin's. Okay. Now, I'd like to say this was an every year occurrence, and I'd even risk having you think I was an elitist who had lots of money. But the fact of the matter is, one of the people in our group was a master sailor. And so he took us out on a boat on the Baltimore harbor and trained the rest of us enough. So we didn't have to hire a captain and crew, which made it affordable enough for us to rent a boat for a week in St. Martin's. The week before we left to go on our sailing trip, a hurricane struck St. Martin's. Now, it wasn't a Category 4 or a Category 5, but it was still a hurricane. No one was killed. But I remember as we were moving from the airport down to the dock where our boat was landed, just how apparent the work of the hurricane that had just come through was. You saw palm trees flattened all over the place. You saw a little house that its foundation was over on this side of the road, and it now was over here about 500 yards in the middle of a pond. And even the little side road that drove down to the dock from the main thing was washed out. And so we had to lug back and forth all our baggage for the trip down this big hill to where the dock where our boat was landed. During that week, the weather was beautiful. And we were sleeping and cooking on the boat, but we had to go periodically shore to restock with water and supplies and things like that. And we found that the maps that we had been given when we got our boat were no longer that helpful. Okay? They weren't helpful because many of the docks where they told us to go ashore had been destroyed in the hurricane. Moreover, on the map, they would tell you where the great coral reefs were and the best place to go to dive for shells. Well, when we went to all those places, the water was now stirred up with so much muddy water that you couldn't see and do any diving to find what was there. So we had to navigate around the island on our own devices, finding places to land and places to dive. Now, as I think about where the church is today, this experience of sailing right after a hurricane has become a metaphor for me of what it means for a congregation to find its mission within God's mission. Our landscape has changed, and the old maps aren't always as helpful as they've been in the past. Many ways we've got to find our way to the shore ourselves and find our way to clear water. Moreover, I think this is a wonderful metaphor to think about how a church is caught up in forces beyond itself. You see, a sailboat really can't sail under its own power. It's completely dependent upon the wind and the currents of the water to allow it to move. The crew doesn't have any control over the wind and the currents. Rather, what the crew can do is it can trim the sails and it can adjust the tiller to put the boat in a position to catch the wind. And then it has to be willing to go where the wind takes it. This is how I think of a church that allows it to get caught up in God's mission. It's not a matter of what we do necessarily, or our programs, as important as they are. It's not a matter of reading a book and then figuring out how to apply that in a particular congregational setting. But rather it's about the deeper and harder task of readying a congregation to open itself to the winds of the Holy Spirit and to follow that where it takes it in its own local setting. Let me give you a second image to think about congregations finding their mission within God's mission. As you can probably tell, I'm a little bit hoarse, and that's because I'm just back from a conference that I went to in Würzburg, Germany, about 3 weeks ago. And on my way flying back, you know how it is when you go to these 4 or 5 day conferences. You never really can get used to the sleep patterns. I mean, they're 6 hours ahead of us, so I was really tired. I'd been waking up, you know, at all kinds of odd hours. And I was surrounded by people on every side who were coughing nonstop, okay? And there's no escape. I mean, what do you do? So anyway, I came back and I got a little cold or flu, congestive flu, whatever it was, to do it, so pardon me for that. But one of the great things that I did when I was in Würzburg is I went to the little museum. It's a jewel of a museum that they have downtown called the Museum of Religion and Art. And it's sponsored, this is a very Catholic area, and it's actually sponsored by the Roman Catholic Church. We were staying in a refurbished monastery that was incredibly beautiful. And I found as I went around the museum, I didn't like a lot of the art there. I just thought it was all suffering, 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 and Mariology, 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 which, you know, was fine, but it got a little old about the 5th or 6th room of that I went into. But finally, I went into this one little relatively small room that was a complete installation of art. And it was really interesting. We got there late in the afternoon, so we were the only people in the whole museum. We went into the room, and right in the center, they had this bronze image of Jesus that was surrounded by some kind of multifaceted crystal. And the lights were off in the room, but at different points, there were kind of laser beams that would shine on that, and then it would reflect Jesus' image back, different angles around the room. And they had different paintings and textures and settings. So you were constantly seeing different facets of Jesus located in different settings. I mean, it was a fantastic, I have no idea how the artist pulled it off. It was a combination of artistic creativity and technological wizardry. But I spent a lot of time just sort of allowing myself to be led from image to image of Jesus in different settings. And I've come to believe that that's a really nice image of what it means for missional churches to find their mission within God's mission. Missional churches come up with ministries or missions that are uniquely their own. No one missional church looks like any other. And that's because each congregation has to participate in Christ's mission in their own local context, guided by their own vision, their own particular group of people, their own building and financial resources, their own particular needs of the community that they're a part of. In the missional church discussion, it's never really about a program that everybody follows in a lockstep fashion, but rather it's about each congregation finding its own mission in its own time and place within the mission of God. Now, what I want to do with you in the rest of my time this afternoon is to try to build on this image of missional churches as sort of reflecting the image of Christ in a way that's appropriate to their own particular local context. And I want to think about three parts of Christ's ministry or Christ's mission that I think we will do well to reflect in our own congregational missions. I'm going to divide these up by simply calling them Christ calling together a community of disciples, Christ building up a community of disciples, and Christ sending of a community of disciples. And I've come to believe that it's helpful to think about the educational ministry of the church in relation to each of these areas or facets of the church's life. Now, describe that as I go along. Let's begin by talking about the calling. One important part of Christ's mission was his calling together a community of disciples. Near the beginning of Matthew, we read this story. As he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending the nets, and he called them. Now this story, I think, is sort of paradigmatic of the calling of Jesus, the gathering together around him of a community of disciples. Commonly, when we think of congregations as participating in Jesus' mission of calling together a community of disciples, we typically think of this in terms of evangelism or evangelization. Not long ago, I was reading a book on cross-cultural psychology for one of my courses. And in the book, the author offered a little text box called Heaven and Hell, a European View. According to Europeans, this author claimed, heaven is where the police are British, the chefs are French, the mechanics German, the lovers Italian, and it's all organized by the Swiss. Hell is where the police are German, the chefs British, the mechanics French, the lovers Swiss, and it's all organized by the Italians. Now, the chapter was on cultural stereotypes. And the author was trying to make a tongue-in-cheek point about the way cultural stereotypes can really narrow our understanding of people. It's funny, I must admit, I used that joke in this presentation that I made at my conference in Europe, and I really wondered if they would get it, but they died laughing. They thought it was a riot. And the problem was we had a lot of Dutch in the group, and they said, "Where are the Dutch?" You know, so the whole rest of the conference, they were sort of making up stereotypes about the Dutch, and casting aspersions at one another in a good-hearted kind of way. But the fact is that we all kind of work with certain stereotypes, and many of us have built up certain stereotypes about what evangelism is all about. I mean, many of my stereotypes of that are the experience of people coming and knocking on my door, bothering me just when I'm getting ready to relax or sit down for supper, or maybe during, we've had the experience during college or in other years of people engaging in sort of interpersonal evangelism and stopping you and asking you when you've been saved and if you've been saved, or trying to come with you to a parachurch group that puts a lot of pressure on you. And, you know, so often in that kind of aggressive evangelism, the covert message seems to be convert and become like me, or become like us. So we've all got stereotypes of evangelism, but there is no question that in the missional context that we're in today, American congregations find themselves in an altered landscape. We're in a mission field in which we must learn to do a much better job of sharing the gospel with others. And I actually think Lutherans have a lot to teach the mainline church as to what this is all about. Last Christmas, I was visiting my mother-in-law, who just moved into a retirement community in Asheville, North Carolina. And one of her friends who had just traveled back from Europe right before Christmas gave her this gift of the largest Lindt chocolate bar that I've ever seen. I promise you, it was that big. And she picked it up in the duty-free shop, you know, in the airport right before she got on the plane, and she gave it to her. Now, my mother-in-law is a very serious chocoholic. She absolutely loves chocolate. But later that night, after the Christmas meal had had a chance to settle a little bit, and we could actually think about food again, she pulled out that bar of chocolate, this gift she'd been given that she prized so much, and she began to break off little bits of it and to share it with the family members, the children and the grandchildren who were gathered in her house. You know, that's pretty much how I think about our participation in Christ's calling of disciples. It's a matter of sharing with others the gift of grace that we've received ourselves. It's not aggressive, it's not defensive, but it's a matter of gift giving. It's a matter of sharing the one we know with those about whom we care. Lutherans know all about this. And you remind us of this in your strong affirmation of justification by grace alone, through faith alone. I would encourage you to think about evangelism in that way as a matter of sharing the gift you've already received. Now, there are a lot of ways that we might unpack what that means practically for the educational ministry of missional churches, but I just want to draw attention to one thing in particular. Let me refer you to Pat Kiefert's book, Welcoming the Stranger, because he draws out some of the practical implications of the perspective I've just offered you for thinking about worship and trying to make worship more welcoming of strangers. And let me point you in anticipation to Jessica Craig Duckworth's dissertation, which is going to be a book on the adult catechumenate as a way of welcoming newcomers in the church. Both of those are very helpful ways of thinking about the intersection of evangelism and education in a missional congregation. But let me instead share with you one little incident where I learned this in my own ministry right after I graduated from seminary. Norma Everest and I graduated seminary in the same class at Yale. We're actually classmates. And this is one of the few times we've seen each other since we graduated. We did recognize each other, barely, but actually, we've kind of crossed paths enough times to know that we don't look quite the same that we looked when we were in seminary. But anyway, when my wife was in seminary as well, when we graduated, we began to share ministry together because we had young children in a single congregation in the mountains of western North Carolina. And the incident that I want to talk to you about, one of the people in this church, her name was Peggy Moody. She was from the Moody's, who had deep roots in the mountains of North Carolina, and she was this wonderful kind of feisty mountain woman. She sold real estate in Maggie Valley, which was developing a lot, kind of a tourist area. Had a lot of Florida snowbirds who would come up there every winter, and so she was actually very successful, and she loved to talk and to tell stories. And, she was kind of feisty, and I loved having her on church meetings because, the pot always got stirred when she was in church meeting. But anyway, I received this phone call late one afternoon, and Peggy had had a stroke. And I was shocked because she was only, in her late 40s. So it was very unusual. Went and visited her at the hospital, and I don't know that they really know why all of a sudden she had a stroke, but she had completely lost her capacity to speak. And one side was paralyzed, pretty much. She lost movement in her arm and leg. And gradually, over a period of many months, she recovered her ability to speak fully, and she learned how to walk again with a cane. And Peggy, as you would imagine, she started off being really pissed off at God about this. Excuse me. She's the kind of person who could give God the finger and feel good about it, And she was doing that, and I was there to hear it. But then she moved into depression, you see, following her anger. And then she moved into joy. One of the most surprising things about her journey through this was the fact that her stroke brought about a profound sense of spiritual renewal in her life. That suddenly she began to see her life with new eyes. She was working so hard and trying to make so much money, and she was just so full of herself that she never stopped to appreciate life and to receive it as a gift from God. And the stroke gave her the opportunity to do that. I remember one conversation that I had with her, must have been, 12 months after the stroke itself, and she was already back on her feet, walking around, beginning to be feisty. And she said, "Preacher, why don't you ever let us talk about Jesus?" I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Talk about what Jesus has meant in our lives." And I said, "Well, we're Presbyterians. This isn't a Baptist church." And I said, in the church, we're supposed to talk about Jesus, not ourselves. And she said, "What did they teach you in seminary anyway?" you know. And so anyway, she said, no, I really think you need to do a better job of letting us talk about how God is involved in our own life and our own experience. And since you're such a chicken, I'll do it myself. So, I trusted this woman. I mean, I had a lot of respect for her. So anyway, that summer during Vacation Bible School, which typically was done in these little churches, it was done in the evening, so folks would come for potluck supper, and then the kids and the youth would have their different classes. She started, for the first time, a class for adults. And it was something like sharing your spiritual story, or I can't even remember it. It seemed pretty hokey to me how she said it. But in any way, it really worked. She got the adults together, participated in this, and she said, now, the first thing I want you to do tonight is begin to write, look back at your life as if it's a spiritual autobiography. And I want you to write the chapter headings for each part of your life. And you're not going to finish it tonight, but I'm going to give you a chance to start working on it. But you need to have it done by the time you get back here tomorrow night, because we're going to share on the basis of that. Well, you know, the farmers sort of looked at each other, the men anyway, who were in it, and the women thought, yeah, this is great. So anyway, the women got the men to come back the next night. They shared what they had done. And before you know it, by the end of the week, these people who knew each other in so many ways knew each other in a deeper way, because they were able to talk. I didn't know that you had that experience back then. I didn't know that you had this or that. And so at the end of the week, Peggy said, I want each of you to go home, and I want you to share with your kids one time of spiritual significance in your life. And then later, instead of having children's stories, this is the kind of woman she was, she said, you can't tell a children's story anymore. We're just going to share our own stories with our children. They can come up and hear who we are. And so we started doing that. We did that for about a year. And then she said, folks, now I want you guys to start sharing the gift you've received from Christ with people you know who need to hear it. And before long, we had an evangelism program going in this church. And it wasn't a program, that's a misnomer. It wasn't anything formal that I started or instituted, but rather it grew out of this educational experience of simply folks sharing the gift of grace that they'd received in their own spiritual journey, and learning to get over feeling so darn embarrassed talking about it and sharing with others. Now, I wish I could take credit for the growth that took place in the congregation. I guess I could take credit for just sort of getting out of the way. But this woman really brought about 15 new people into the church, simply by encouraging folks to share their stories with their friends and their neighbors and the people that they worked with. That's how I think about the calling and our participation in the calling in a missional church. It invites us to think about the intersection of education and evangelism in a new way. And I don't think that I've said anything theologically that really is antithetical to what you guys believe as Lutherans. And in fact, I think Lutherans, as I said earlier, know a lot about what it is to share the gift of grace that you've received yourself as a free gift with other people. Let's move on and talk about the upbuilding. Jesus not only called disciples, but he also invited them to come and follow him. His core group of disciples traveled with him as he moved from town to town. They walked, they ate, they talked together. He heard them teaching the crowds. They received special instruction in private. He sent them out on little practice mission trips. In all these ways, Jesus was building up a community that would carry on his ministry when he was no longer with them. The gospel stories make it clear that this upbuilding by Jesus in his earthly ministry was not complete. As Jesus moved to his cross, as he in fact was crucified, the disciples had already fallen away, and Peter had denied him. It wasn't until God had raised Jesus from the dead and sent the Spirit on his followers in Jerusalem that Jesus' work with his disciples began to bear fruit. Now, I tell that because I think it's a really important reminder that what's important is God's mission. Christ alone overcame sin and death. And our mission as disciples is simply to participate in the one mission that he's done on our behalf in our stead. The Apostle Paul describes it like this: "For no one can lay any foundation other than the one that has been laid. That foundation is Jesus Christ." Around that same area, Paul talks about how leaders like himself and Apollos may build on this foundation, but it's God alone who lays the foundation. And in a neighboring verse, he puts it, he says, it's God alone who gives the growth. Now, the upbuilding of the community of disciples is a second dimension, or second important activity in a missional church. Far more than we've done in the past, I think today we've got to think in terms of both education and formation in the upbuilding of the community of faith. There are several reasons for this. I've got them on the outline. Number one, people are not participating in traditional forms of Christian education as they did in the past. Among all Protestants, 23% participate in Sunday school during a given week and 21% in a small group. I hate to tell you that's terrible as it is, it's pitiful, but that includes Baptists. When we talk about mainline Protestants, only 15% attend Sunday school and 15% a small group during a given week. Reason two, there's evidence that congregations are not very successful in helping children and youth learn the faith. Now, I want to share with you a little bit of probably the gold standard of research on adolescent faith that's taken place in the last, I would say, probably 30, 40, or maybe even 50 years. It's written up in a book called Soul Searching by a sociologist. He was at University of North Carolina. He now is at Notre Dame, named Christian Smith. And he, and a group of his students or former students, did survey research on adolescents, and then they carried out over 3,000 interviews. A lot. This is substantial. Smith describes the faith held by most adolescents in the United States today as what he calls moralistic, therapeutic deism. It consists of beliefs like these. Number one, a God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions. The central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life except when God is needed to resolve a problem. Number five, good people go to heaven when they die. And reflecting on his findings, Smith writes, to the extent that the teens we interviewed did manage to articulate what they understood and believed religiously, it became clear that most religious teenagers either do not comprehend what their own religious traditions say they're supposed to believe, or they do understand it and simply don't care to believe it. Either way, it's apparent that most religiously affiliated U.S. teens are not particularly interested in espousing and upholding the beliefs of their faith traditions, or that their communities of faith are failing in attempts to educate their youth or both. Damning. Number three, Research on emerging adults has discovered that there's relatively little relationship between the religious training that they received throughout childhood and the religious beliefs they hold during their 20s. Now, I have in mind here a book that you may not have heard of. Probably some of you have heard of Chris Smith's book, Soul Searching. It's gotten a lot of press. This is the book that I would strongly recommend. It's a book by Jeffrey Arnett, and it's called Emerging Adulthood. And it focuses on the age group between 18 and 30. We actually do have a fair amount of stuff going on in churches for children and for youth, and we have a lot of stuff for married folks, but we have not much at all for the cohort that he calls emerging adults. And he wants to argue that emerging adulthood is a new stage in the life cycle, that we can't think of these folks anymore as, simply having an extended adolescence. They're not just teenagers anymore. They've left home. They're, earning a living. They're living away by themselves. They're wrestling with more serious issues, and that yet they're not fully adult yet. They're betwixt and between. And emerging adults, according to Arnett, are engaged in intense exploration of their identity, what kind of job they want to be involved in, who they might want to marry. On average, they're marrying much later than their parents. And I had my class, most of the people at Princeton are young, they're in this cohort, they're this stage of the life cycle, and they had them read that. They said that really, really helps us understand who we are and our group. It kind of normalizes our experience, because our parents keep thinking that we're really, not fulfilling some set of expectations, and yet to find out that, our search that's still going on is normal, is really, really helpful. But one of the alarming things that Arnett discovered in this book was, at least during this period, there seems to be almost no relationship between their childhood education and what they believe during this period of time. 60% of the emerging adults in his sample had high exposure to religious training in childhood, and 20% had moderate exposure. So it wasn't that the sample was bad. I mean, these people had been exposed to religion during childhood, but that it didn't seem to have much effect during this period. This is a very different pattern than adolescence, when parents' beliefs and practices still seem to have an impact on adolescent religiosity. Something changes between adolescence and emerging adulthood. If they go to college, they are exposed to more and more influence and ideas outside the family. But perhaps Arnett speculates, most important of all, emerging adults as a group feel, and I quote him here, they have to decide for themselves what they believe about religious questions. For most emerging adults, simply to accept what their parents have taught them about religion and carry on the same religious tradition as their parents would represent a kind of failure, an abdication of their responsibility to think for themselves, to become independent from their parents, and to decide on their own beliefs. Fourth, many people who are returning to church during adulthood need healing even more than they need education, at least initially. Over the past year, I've been carrying out my own body of research on pastors of missional churches. And one of the pastors who I interviewed made the point like this. He said, "There's something about the damage done in the fall that's been compounded by life wounds that leaves many people today needing healing and wholeness. For a while, anyway, after they come back to the church, people just want to stay in the womb of the church because they're really wounded. They aren't ready to get out yet and do mission. They need healing. They need somebody to hold their hand for a while. I've been experimenting," he goes on to say, "for a long time with my army. My army is not equipped to go out and fight this missional trip. They need medics, not drill sergeants. So we begun to do a lot of things like divorce recovery and grief recovery and recovery from alcohol and drugs. We've given people a chance to heal before we ask them to serve. Now, all four of those reasons that I've given you make it crystal clear that the context we're in today really challenges us to think beyond the old patterns of Christian education that we've been relying on for so long, the Sunday school and Bible studies and women's circles and on and on. You have your own version of those. But rather, I think increasingly we need to think about the upbuilding of the community of faith in terms of formation and education. Formation takes place when Christ takes shape in the way people relate to one another and practice the Christian way of life in their own community. People learn about forgiveness, not simply hearing about it in the Sunday school, but by receiving forgiveness and forgiving one another. People learn about the healing power of God's grace when they receive concrete support and recovering in their congregation from alcohol abuse or a failed marriage. Formation takes place when the leaders of a congregation reach out across racial lines in search of reconciliation, and they invite others in the congregation to join them in participating in the process. I could go on, but you get the point that I'm making. I think more important today than the programs we offered or the formal teaching and education we offer is the quality of relationships and the kind of community we offer folks as they come back to the church and grow up in the church and try to continue to grow while they're in the church. I think education today is better thought of as teaching people to understand what they're already experiencing. The stories of Scripture tell our story. It's why we do things the way we do here. It means that educational today must be formational and not simply informational. I'd share another quote from my missional pastor's research, but I'm running out of time, and I want to move on to my last point. So we've thought about the calling, in which we're beginning to think about the intersection of education and evangelism, in which we share with others the gift of grace that we've received ourselves. And we're thinking now about the upbuilding of the community of disciples as a process of formation and education. And I want to end by talking a little bit about the sending of the community of faith. Perhaps the paradigmatic text of the sending of the community of disciples is found in John 20:19 through 22. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he had said this, he showed him his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." These are the words of the crucified and risen Lord to the community of disciples. He speaks peace into their midst. No doubt he's trying to calm their nerves and to reassure them. They're huddled together behind closed doors because they're afraid of the authorities who might come and do to them what had already been done to Jesus. But in speaking peace into their midst, he's also speaking shalom into their midst, God's promised future for creation. And he's inviting them to take up and participate in the actualization of that peace in their lives as a community of disciples. Now, there are many, and then he breathes the Spirit on them, empowering them to serve as witnesses to God's peace. How do you get a congregation to think about mission not as a program done by a few, but as service and outreach undertaken by all? That's the key. A missional church doesn't think of mission as just, those few little outreach activities that the saints of the church do on the church's behalf. But it begins to cultivate what we might call a missional imagination and a missional culture in the community of faith that invites everyone in the congregation to see themselves as in a mission field and called to serve as missionaries. I'm going to draw my presentation short by just sharing you with one of the best examples I've seen of this in some research that I did for one of the books that Margaret mentioned, The Teaching Ministry of Congregations. I studied in that book a church in South Korea and South Africa and the United States, and I was really interested in trying to see if the core tasks of the teaching ministry were similar in different cultural contexts. And I studied a church called the Somong Presbyterian Church in Seoul, Korea. This is one of the mega churches of Korea. It started with 11 members, and within 20 years it had 40,000 members. Now think of that. That's as large as the University of Michigan. I've never seen a congregation as big as it was that had such a strong sense of missional identity and culture. How did they do it? What made a difference? Well, one of the things, they did a lot of things, but the idea was that they had this, one of the things they did is they had this, they had certain practices that tried to make the point that everyone is a leader and everyone is a missionary. With the leaders, they undertook the practice they called the recycling of leaders. If you were a leader on the board of the church and you had a special kind of status, kind of a key opinion setter, a key player in the congregation, they strongly encouraged you, after you served your allotted period of time, and they always had term limits, to take on one of the more humble jobs in the church. So when I went around and did participant observation of the congregation, I found, people who were the chairs of boards of major national corporations who were members of the congregation who were working in the nursery and who were also working in the kitchen as servers. And they call this, they had some strange name for it, but the image of decordiating or something like that of the nobility of the church. And they wanted, I'm sorry, I can't remember it exactly, but the point was that they want to strip off the bark. That's what the image was. When you become a leader, they felt, too often you begin to like the social status that goes away. So we have to strip that off. So you remember again that leaders are those who serve. The second thing they did that was just so powerful is that they had the whole church organized into these little cell groups, small groups. And every group had to have a mission. You could not just get together and have prayer and Bible study for yourself, but you had to be concretely engaged in some sort of service on the community, on the church's behalf, out in the community. And they had a tendency to bring people who shared a similar profession so they could address issues that drew on their common expertise. So they had a whole series of cell groups of architects who were out there engaging in building programs in the slums, basically, of Korea, where they had the know-how, the resources, they knew what needed to be done. They drew on other people in the church for the labor, and they basically were, doing the equivalent of 500 Habitat for Humanity houses every year in this congregation. They're one of the churches that during the famine in North Korea were sending grain to the north in spite of the objections of the American government, and on and on and on. The whole point was that in the sending of the community, it's not about a missional program. It's about a missional imagination and culture, that everyone in the church gets caught up in the idea and the vision of participating and serving Christ in Jesus' name. Now, what I've tried to do today, and I'm just going to sort of stop abruptly, is describe for you a missional church in which we think about education in new and different ways. Thinking about education as intersecting evangelism, formation, and outreach.